The first thing to say is with the invasion in 2014, Putin believed that he was raising up and gathering in the Russian-speaking peoples. So he gathered in 2 million people from Crimea, but lost 40 million people from Ukraine. And that's really part of the process we're seeing at the moment. He's not gathering in people anymore. He's losing them. Now, A.J.P. Taylor, the historian of my youth, used to say nothing is inevitable until it happens. And it is also true that people like me, sort of analysts, always look at probability yardsticks. So is something going that way in terms of the probability of the dissolution of the Russian Federation happening, or is it going downwards? Well, at the moment, it looks like it's going positive upwards. And there's really 4 parts to what is happening in what he potentially might lose. The first one is that the Russian Federation is made up of the Russian parts, but also 22 non-Russian federations. And there are these centrifugal forces which are potentially going to rip it apart. There's a burden of unequal sacrifice in lots of the ethnic republics. The 2 most prominent ones that people talk about are Buryatia and Tuva. And they're some of the republics in Siberia and Central Asia which could have these centripetal forces. That's the first one. The second one is in the immediate sphere of influence, those states that really Russia did try and gather in prior to 2014. And here we're talking about Transnistria and Moldova and Georgia, so they could be ripped apart. The third thing is that the CTSO, that's the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is 6 post-Soviet states, including the Stans, Belarus, they could also be lost to the Russian sphere of influence. And there's no way that in terms of Putin's grand strategic objective, which prior to the war was to regain lost territory and spheres of influence, that what we now call the Bucharest Nine, those former Soviet states that border Ukraine, are ever going to contemplate going back anywhere near the orbit of Russia. And indeed, that is the reason that those former Soviet states wished to join NATO. They weren't coerced into doing it. They did it because they freely joined, because they knew what it's like to be under the tyranny of another state. We always say in sort of Clausewitzian terms that your total means, your fighting power and equipment, multiplied by your strength of will, gives you the power of resistance. And one of the things, of course, that you can do is shatter the will of the enemy. That is the easiest way to defeat an enemy. So one of the things I would think that they will try and do is use information ops to fragment and amplify what has been going on at the moment. One of the things that we really saw with Prigozhin was a disunity of command. And one of the things you need when you're fighting a theatre-level war is unity of command. So we've already seen these psychological ripples that have begun, firstly with the incursions into Belgorod from the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Liberty of Russian Legion. And these psychological ripples really have been amplified by the events of last weekend with Prigozhin. Now, I don't think it was a coup, but that doesn't matter. This could be, again, seen as a triggering event, and that is why it's important. Now, the factors of success in 20th century warfare were really fourfold. The first one was control of the air. The second one was shock. The third, surprise. And the fourth one, offensive wrecking. In terms of what is going on at the moment on the battlefield, we have a conundrum from both ends of that, where Russia really has control of the air, and Ukraine is trying to do offensive reconnaissance to try and drag its main combat power through. And you have a number of capability mismatches, which the Ukrainians are trying to equalize. That is drone versus counter-drone, the Russian electronic warfare capability to knock down the Russian drones. And here, when we talk about Ukrainian drones, we're really talking about quadcopters and micro or small drones. We're not talking about those that we saw at the start of the war with the Bayraktar TB2s from Turkey. And the third mismatch really is the way that the Soviets are using, or the Russians are using, their aerial combat power. That's both in terms of their drones, their aviation, attack helicopters, and close air support to try and negate the combined arms, particularly the air defense capability of the Ukrainians. And it's overcoming that before you can get up to the serious problem of trying to clear quite a formidable and deep positional defense from the Russians. Part of the thing that the Ukrainians, I think, are doing at the moment is trying to draw out the Russian reserves so they can attack in depth and in strength the place and time of their choosing for what they see to be the decisive operational breakthrough. One of the original concepts of the war was that I thought there would be a equivalent from the Russians of a shock and awe campaign, and that is that they would try and get air superiority from the off, which would enable their ground forces to maneuver. Now, they didn't do that, and in terms of how we look at how air power is applied, we look at sort of air parity, air superiority, air supremacy, and within that you have a number of functions which take place. You have close air support supporting the ground troops, you have air interdiction to try and take out the follow-on forces, and you have combat support to try and take out the forces in the air. Now, what the Ukrainians were given really by the West in the first year was the means, air defense means, to push the Russian air and aviation back. The losses that they were incurring were too great for them to launch missiles or anything from their own airspace. This is why, for example, in the Russian deep battle, that is the launch of cruise missiles or ballistic missiles, they're being done from Russian airspace because the chances of their aircraft being taken out if they have incursions into Ukrainian airspace is amplified. Now, the ability of the Wagner Group to knock down potentially somewhere between 7 to 9 aircraft, both the Ilyushin-22, which is the command post, and a number of helicopters, including 3 electronic warfare helicopters. That was significant, really, because Prigozhin, in lots of ways, was like a Pied Piper. As he was going north from Rostov, he was gaining more and more Telegram supporters. So the Russians needed to try and make sure he was knocked off the airwaves. So he would have had millions of followers by the time he got to Moscow. Not that I think it was a coup. So in lots of ways, the air defense in a national sense, that is the ability of the Russians to hit infrastructure or prime or high-value targets, as we call it, really in Kyiv and Lvov and all that sort of stuff, has largely been negated. I think one of the significant things in the last few weeks is the performance of both the Patriot missile systems, American system, of course, which has also been given to them by the Dutch and the Germans, and the NASAMS, that's the National Surface-to-Air Missile System. The key thing about that is that has been able to take out all the ballistic or cruise missiles on those high-value targets which have been fired from Russia. The so what or significance of that, if you were a Russian nuclear planner, in terms of if you did go to a really escalatory posture and wanted to launch tactical nuclear weapons at Ukraine, those are the types of launch vehicles that you would use. So that would also put Russia on a dilemma. Now, I'm not saying for one moment here that there is going to be a move towards nuclear weapons. Neither am I saying that it is imminent. There is still a real threat, as President Biden said on the 20th of this month, 20th of June. But that is a dilemma for the Russians. But they can localize their combat power at the place and time of their choosing of where the Ukrainians are, and that causes a problem at the moment for the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians need to innovate quickly in those areas where they've taken losses, where that may have occurred, to overcome that before they can maneuver in detail. Putin's been there a long time. He's been really there 24 years. You can say that is twice the length of time as Hitler. Hitler was in power 12 years, Putin 24 years. One of the things that longevity gives you is the ability to consolidate power, to crush dissidents and to hack minds so that you control the narrative. Now, one of the things that happened at the weekend was Putin lost control of the narrative. And one of the things that we've seen in the 2 or 3 days since is the fact that he has been on TV at least 3 times, is him trying to show his authority and that he's in the ascendancy once more. However, controlling the narrative when you've got other alternative centers now shows that I think that he's weakened, because authoritarian regimes always seem secure right up to the moment that they're no longer secure. We really sort of saw that with Ceausescu in 1989 and in Romania. So he has been weakened. That doesn't mean he wouldn't be there at the end, and it doesn't mean that if he were to be replaced, it wouldn't be as bad a regime as Putin's, because there's no sort of liberal Democrats really to take his place. But he's weakened for a number of reasons. Firstly, we've seen alternative power centers. Now, one of the functions of the state is the monopoly of violence. And we saw from the Wagner Group is not really a private military security company in a way we expect in the West. It really was partly a product of the GRU, the Russian intelligence service, and has always been used as a tool of Russian foreign policy overseas, and the way they have been hoovering up resources and providing security and training for authoritarian regimes in Africa and the Middle East. But that loss of monopoly of violence has also shown that other groups could potentially do this in the future. The second reason he's weakened is because it was really his vassal state, Lukashenko, who brokered the deal. It was not someone in Putin's orbit who brokered the deal, and that sort of seems curious. The third one is that the theory of victory is really being turned on its head. Now, we know that Putin still has a maximalist objective, that is, total victory and unconditional surrender, really, of Ukraine. But he has a minimalist army and armed forces to do that. So the theory of victory for Russia really goes on along the line that the West will tire of supporting Ukraine, and that, therefore, that gives him the chance to negotiate from a position of strength when he already occupies the illegally annexed oblasts, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Luhansk and Donetsk, along with Ukraine. Now, it turns it on its head, because it's now we see that Russia has a Russia problem, and all the things that I articulated at the beginning about the centrifugal forces which could take or break Russia apart may be more in the mind of we need to preserve what we've got rather than try and get what we haven't got. So that really causes a problem for Russia in its theory of victory. The fifth one is, will Putin's allies stay on side? None of them rushed to support him in the hours after Prigozhin was going north. And one of the things you will also potentially see in the next few days, again, the same as Hitler did in 1934 with the Night of the Long Knives with the brown shirts, is will we see a number of purges? Certainly Surovikin has been mentioned. I mean, what the commander of the Southern Military District was doing in the lack of response to Prigozhin as he was marching north. So there's a number of competing centers there, and elite defections are one of the ways that a regime can collapse. And if a regime collapses, that stops the fighting. The benign part of this at the moment is the population, but we'll have to see where they go, because again, one of the things of 24 years of authoritarian rule has been a depoliticized population who haven't had much skin in the game. As long as they were benign and were looked after by Putin, they were quite content. But it's certainly true that they don't want to be mobilized in significant waves for the future. That also was one of Prigozhin's gripes, in that he only saw victory as being possible if there were waves of mobilization, and that Russia were mobilized along the sort of Soviet era for total war. And that included, if necessary, his speech on the 25th of May, that Russia living as North Korea for a few years. And I don't think many people in Russia would like that. Now, we've seen these forces really for a number of years. So, for example, back in 2018, when the Novichok episode occurred in Salisbury, I was briefing then that the refrain in Russia at the time, because of all the indicators being downwards in terms of GDP, population growth, lack of inward investment, was no future. That is why certainly the intelligentsia were leaving Russia between 2018 and 21, and then of course that accelerated in 22. So if you had no future, The worry then, because we're at Putin 4.0 and it could be Putin 6.0 because he could be there until 2036, was that Russia could implode and that there could be civil war in 5 to 10 years' time. And one of the worries about that and how the West might need to engage was that we worried about Yugoslavia imploding in the late 80s, early 90s. An implosion in Russia, sort of Bosnia with nukes, would not be in anyone's interest whatsoever. The object of war is a better peace, but the key questions are from whose perspective and whose rules get to apply. So to answer that question, you need to look at why fighting stops and also why fighting doesn't stop. So fighting stops for 1, 2, or 3 reasons. It either stops because of decisive military victory. That is what Ukraine are trying to attempt to do either this year or next year. It stops because of the improbability of victory. That is, that we get to a stalemate when both sides need to believe that they need to negotiate. Or it stops because of unacceptable costs, and those might be military, they might be economic, they might be societally in terms of the population. And all those come into this aspect of the fact that, Russia might implode again. But why fighting doesn't stop is for the same reasons, that both sides need to have sufficient victory in terms of what they believe their objectives to be to satisfy the power bases and the sacrifices which have been made. That makes things difficult in terms of it might be there for us to see conflict termination, but it's difficult to see a conflict resolution. And that essentially is the difference between winning the war and winning the peace. Winning the peace for Ukraine would, of course, be that it's within its 1991 boundaries and that it joins the EU and has security guarantees for NATO or some other mechanism and enhanced neutrality or whatever. Winning the peace for Russia, if one believes that its strategic objectives were to regain territory and spheres of influence, would be that they need to, as a minimum, remain in Crimea and the 4 oblasts. Now, those two don't compute because the Duma, the Russian parliament, have legislated that into account that no one can give away those oblasts in the future. Counter to that, of course, is that if you've legislated something in, you can also legislate something out. So this comes to the real difficult position of what is the sort of peace that should be sought. So a success of Russia being able to still be on the left bank of the Dnipro, that is essentially that they've got land for peace, or that there is a frozen conflict, which is essentially the same, either via an armistice or something of that kind, would be an unjust peace, would not be a better peace from a Ukrainian perspective. And if you really want a big strategic defeat for Russia, that is militarily, and then they implode, you then get to really what would be called historically the Carthaginian peace, i.e. from when the Romans had defeated Carthage and Alexandria was ploughed into the ground with no trace of the civilization there for the future. Now that is where, if you did that, you'd have real problems in the way that sort of post-Treaty of Versailles you had problems and lead to these sort of stab in the back sort of theories for the future. And there is the real problem that if you want to engage with Russia, there needs to be a minimum which would enable that to do when they are defeated. And the 3 criteria really for that would be a full Russian withdrawal from Ukraine, an acceptance that it should pay reparations to Ukraine because the damage so far, the last figure I saw from the World Bank was something like $450 billion. And the third one would be accountability for some of the genocidal acts. We know that over 81,000 war crimes have been committed. Now, you can only do that if you believe that you can reset relations with Russia, and probably only a strategic defeat with Russia would do that, because the other way of looking at it is that Russia is incapable of change because it just wants to break away from any Western society influence. The culture and values of the West are seen as inimical to Putin and certainly the coterie which he surrounds himself with and the authoritarian state which is grown out of his his 24 years in power. I wouldn't worry too much about Belarus. Now, Lukashenko has played a canny hand as a vassal state of Russia. He's given sort of overt support without being tied into the campaigning. Now, it's always been the case that Ukraine have had to base troops on their northern flank because there's always a threat and you can't disregard that. But Lukashenko, I think, knows, given the protests which went on 2 or 3 years ago, that he is pretty vulnerable if that flank is exploited by the Belarus forces, who are believed to be very good, and are defeated. I mean, he, rather like Putin, is there to remain in power, and he doesn't want anything to disrupt that. I wouldn't worry too much about Prigozhin being there, because at the moment we don't know how true that would be for the future. Now, we know that probably the Wagner Group will not be allowed to export all its equipment and capabilities there. So in terms of how the Ukrainians have presented it, it is in military terms an economy of force task. That would be correct because a number of what we would call geographically avenues of approach for attack axis is not very big. People also worry, of course, because of the fact that nuclear weapons have been put in Belarus. I also wouldn't worry too much about that at the moment. As I've said before, the threat is potentially real, but there is no imminency. So there is a difference in risk analysis between likelihood, which is low, and of course impact if you were to use nuclear weapons, which is very high. But there are a number of markers or indicators that one would look at for potential use of nuclear weapons, and none of those are there at the moment. And they would include, for example, a complete ramping up of rhetoric from Putin that said that this was going to be in the offing, or a rout of Russian forces for which he was personally blamed at home. Thirdly, the movement of nuclear weapons from storage sites into the field, and those would be some of the markers we would look for. None of those are in train at the moment. Neither would I think them to be in train in the near future, because one of the successes, in a way, from the Western perspective in the last 16 months has been the mutual deterrence that has gone on. So although Putin may have a number of times said or else to the West, we keep on crossing his red lines without any impact. So, for example, how many NATO countries have been attacked? The answer is 0. Did he do anything about the incipient membership of Finland and Sweden to stop them, knock them out? The answer is he didn't. So they know that if the combat potential and industrial potential of the West were mobilized against them, the war would be shortened in Ukraine pretty quickly, and they would probably be defeated, particularly if American air power and Western air power were mobilized against them.